At 6:30 a.m. on September 2, 2025, the Caribbean Sea looked calm, like any other morning. But in a dimly lit command center, thousands of miles away, the tranquility shattered. US surveillance screens lit up with a sharp red trace, a Venezuelan speedboat slicing across the water at maximum throttle. Its twin outboard engines screamed as they pushed the fiberglass hull forward, leaving a white trail of churned foam. On board, a dozen armed men leaned into the spray, convinced they were just running another smuggling trip. They joked, smoked, and radioed back to Caracas. To them, this was routine. Another payday. Another successful run. But what they didn't know was chilling. The ocean around them had already turned into a killbox. They weren't invisible. They weren't free. They were trapped. Far above, the sky wasn't empty. American satellites were already locked in, their infrared eyes tracking the boat's glowing exhaust trail like a flare in darkness. Every move, every burst of speed, every faint chemical trace from the engines was logged and fed into computers faster than the smugglers could blink. From the very moment the throttle slammed forward, they weren't running. They were being herded. At 25,000 feet, a US Navy P-8 Poseidon aircraft circled silently. This wasn't just another patrol plane. It was a flying predator, its radar sweeping vast swaths of ocean, painting the boat's location with mathematical precision. Even when clouds rolled in, the Poseidon sensors pierced through, mapping the smugglers' every zigzag, and their encrypted radio chatter. Not so encrypted. The Poseidon's antennae vacuumed up every word, every coded burst, storing them in US servers before the smugglers' handlers in Caracas even heard the reply. And then on the horizon came something the men on the boat never saw: the faint silhouette of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Over 9,000 tons of American steel, loaded with missiles, radars, and firepower so overwhelming that against a wooden or fiberglass drug boat, it was the equivalent of swatting a mosquito with a sledgehammer. To the smugglers, the destroyer was invisible. To the Navy, the boat's fate was already a closed file. They thought they were speeding toward freedom. In reality, they had just crossed into America's cage of steel and data. The smugglers didn't know it, but the very ocean they trusted had betrayed them. In US Navy doctrine, the moment they roared across that invisible line, they entered what's called a killbox. The word sounds theatrical, but its meaning is brutally efficient. A killbox isn't just a patch of ocean, it's a mathematical trap. Think of it this way: once a vessel crosses into a killbox, multiple layers of surveillance and firepower overlap so tightly that escape becomes impossible. It doesn't matter if the target speeds up, cuts left, or makes a desperate U-turn, every potential escape vector is already predicted, tracked, and covered. In this part of the Caribbean, the Venezuelan boat wasn't running free. It was inside a chess game, already 5 moves from checkmate. Above them, satellites weren't just taking pictures. They were sucking in data the smugglers couldn't even imagine. Thermal sensors logged the boat's heat signature. Signal intelligence arrays captured stray radio chatter, scanning for frequencies linked to cartel networks. Even the faint trail of hydrocarbons bleeding from the engine's exhaust was being tracked like breadcrumbs across the sea. The men thought they were fast. At full throttle, their boat could hit 50 knots, a blistering pace for smugglers. But in the Navy's world, speed doesn't matter. Against sensors moving at the speed of light, 50 knots is a crawl. The smugglers were racing with confidence, but in reality, they were a bug pinned under glass. And then came the next layer, the P-8 Poseidon. To outsiders, it looks like a commercial airliner painted gray. To the smugglers, it was invisible, cruising high above the clouds. But in reality, it was their personal executioner. Its ANAPY-10 radar was sweeping hundreds of miles of open ocean in a single rotation, able to pick out even the smallest wooden skiff. Every time the smugglers adjusted course, the Poseidon adjusted too, shadowing them quietly, never losing the target. The Poseidon wasn't just watching, it was listening. Every encrypted call back to Venezuela was intercepted. What the smugglers thought was private cartel traffic was already decrypted, tagged, and stored in American databases before the message even reached Caracas. The men spoke freely, thinking they were safe. In truth, they were feeding intelligence directly into their hunters' hands. Meanwhile, the surface trap was closing. Out on the horizon, the Arleigh Burke destroyer was maneuvering into perfect position. Its Aegis combat system was quietly linking with every radar, every aircraft, every satellite in range. The smugglers weren't being chased by one ship. They were already surrounded by an invisible web of American firepower. The boat could sprint north. It could turn south. It could even try to vanish westward into Venezuelan waters. None of it mattered. The grid was already drawn. The Killbox was sealed. When the order finally came down, it didn't sound like the movies. There were no dramatic speeches, no raised voices, no last-minute chase across the waves. Inside the Combat Information Center of the destroyer, the moment arrived with the calm precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The Poseidon's crew transmitted a simple message. Target confirmed. On board the destroyer, the watch officer acknowledged. No emotion, no hesitation. The process had been rehearsed 1,000 times. Then the ship's fire control radars aligned, invisible beams of energy locking onto the speedboat below. The smugglers, laughing and shouting over the roar of their engines, had no idea. They never saw the destroyer's weapon systems tracking them. They never even knew they were being marked for death. In a single, clinical instant, the command was executed. A precision strike erupted from the destroyer's arsenal. The smuggler's fiberglass hull, thin, fragile, and utterly defenseless, shattered into burning wreckage. To them, it was sudden chaos. Fire, impact, screams, swallowed by the roar of the sea. To the US Navy, it was nothing more than a blip, erased from a screen. Escape had never been possible. From the moment their engines throttled up that morning, the outcome was mathematically certain. What the smugglers believed was open ocean freedom had in reality been a cage built from satellites, aircraft, and steel. Within hours, the Pentagon announced the results. Washington declared it a counter-narcotics victory, releasing details that the boat wasn't just a random smuggler's run. According to officials, it had been carrying operatives and narcotics directly tied to the Tren de Aragua, Venezuela's most feared criminal network. 11 suspected cartel members, gone in an instant. President Donald Trump himself wasted no time, blasting out a message on social media. America will hunt cartel operatives wherever they hide. To his supporters, it was proof of resolve. To critics, it was a dangerous overreach. But while Washington framed the strike as success, the reaction abroad was explosive. In Caracas, President Nicolás Maduro appeared on national television, his voice trembling with fury. He called the attack outright aggression, accusing the United States of murdering Venezuelan citizens in international waters. He insisted the strike was not just illegal, but an act of war. And suddenly, what had begun as a quiet smuggler interception had transformed into a global incident. The strike on that small Venezuelan speedboat might have ended in seconds, but its political aftershock shook the hemisphere. In Washington, officials called it a clean hit, a blow against narcotics networks, but in Caracas, the narrative was entirely different. President Nicolás Maduro appeared on state television within hours, standing behind a podium draped in the Venezuelan flag, his fist clenched, his voice raised. He declared the attack a violation of sovereignty and an act of murder. The men on that boat, he argued, weren't faceless criminals. They were Venezuelan citizens executed without trial. His words ignited fury across the country. On cue, Venezuelan state media rolled footage of F-16 fighter jets revving engines on cracked, aging airstrips and soldiers marching through coastal garrisons. Anchors spoke of defiance, of standing tall against foreign aggression. For everyday Venezuelans battered by sanctions and economic collapse, the images fueled nationalist pride. For Maduro, it was a chance to rally support at home by painting Washington as the enemy. But behind the fiery rhetoric, the truth was harsh. Venezuela's armed forces were shadows of their former strength. Its F-16 fleet, acquired decades earlier from the United States, was crippled by lack of spare parts. Its navy couldn't hope to challenge a single American destroyer. Caracas couldn't fight Washington head-on, but it could provoke, and provoke it did. 3 days after the strike, as the USS Jason Dunham, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, cruised in international waters, Two Venezuelan F-16s screamed overhead at dangerously low altitude. They tore past the destroyer's decks so close that the shockwaves rippled across the surface of the water. For Venezuelan state TV, it was framed as defiance, a show of strength. For the US Navy, it was a gift of intelligence. Every radar ping, every electronic transmission from those aging fighters, was captured, logged, and stored. To American analysts, the flyby wasn't a threat, it was an opportunity. Each maneuver gave away more about Venezuela's tactics, communication patterns, and electronic fingerprints. What Maduro framed as defiance only deepened the imbalance. Still, the danger of escalation was real. Orders aboard the Dunham were clear: hold fire, unless directly threatened. But in modern warfare, where a supersonic jet can close distance in seconds, the line between provocation and attack blurs fast. One wrong radar lock, one accidental missile release, and the Caribbean could ignite into open conflict. Washington didn't back down. Instead, it doubled down. Within a week, 10 F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters were deployed to Puerto Rico, barely 2 hours from Venezuelan airspace. Unlike Caracas' aging jets, these were fifth-generation aircraft invisible to radar, designed to dismantle enemy defenses before their pilots even knew they were under attack. The message was unmistakable. If Venezuela wanted to gamble in the skies, the United States was ready to raise the stakes. And suddenly, a single destroyed speedboat had become the trigger for a Caribbean standoff that threatened to destabilize the entire region. By the end of the first week of September 2025, the Caribbean looked deceptively calm. Blue water stretched to the horizon. Merchant ships carried oil and cargo across familiar routes. To an ordinary sailor, nothing seemed unusual. But beneath that surface calm, the balance of power had shifted. The destruction of one Venezuelan speedboat had set off a chain reaction. Now American warships prowled the Caribbean in numbers not seen in years. Their radars swept the skies. Their combat air patrols pushed deep into contested waters. And from Puerto Rico, stealth F-35s prowled the edges of Venezuelan airspace, silent, invisible predators just waiting for the order to strike. Regional governments felt the tension immediately. In Colombia, officials worried that an unstable Venezuela could spill violence across their shared border. In the islands of the Lesser Antilles, leaders whispered about what would happen if trade routes were disrupted. Even shipping companies began rerouting oil tankers, fearful of a sudden clash turning the sea lanes into free fire zones. What started as a counter-narcotics mission now looked like the opening act of a new Cold War standoff in the Americas. For Washington, the mission was a textbook victory. The smugglers' boat was gone, their radios intercepted, their routes mapped, every voice captured, every frequency logged, every maneuver archived into U.S. intelligence databases. In the Pentagon's eyes, the operation wasn't just about eliminating one vessel. It was about building a living library of cartel logistics and Venezuelan military behavior. For Caracas, the incident was a humiliation. Dressed as defiance, Maduro could roar on television. He could order jets to buzz American destroyers. But none of it changed the reality. Venezuela's military was aging, underfunded, and outmatched. Every act of defiance only handed Washington more intelligence on a silver platter. And for the world, the incident was a warning. Allies stayed quiet, but analysts voiced concerns. If every superpower claimed the right to sink vessels in international waters on suspicion alone, what was left of maritime law? Would the seas become lawless arenas where suspicion meant execution? The smugglers thought the ocean was freedom, but the truth was darker. In 2025, freedom at sea didn't exist. Not when satellites, aircraft, and warships could stitch an invisible cage across thousands of miles in seconds. That small Venezuelan speedboat wasn't just a cartel run, it was a signal, a test, and a trigger. The lesson was brutal. The US Navy had proven that in modern warfare there are no escapes, only traps waiting to be sprung. So now the question falls to you. Was the United States right to strike? Or did Washington escalate a smuggling run into a crisis that could ignite the region? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm curious to see where you stand. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and join the fleet for more stories from the front lines of modern power. Because if there's one truth the smugglers learned too late, it's this: When you gamble against the US Navy, the house always wins.